with Renee.
Yo. We wait all week and all day for more Saturdays with Renee.
What's up, world? Right back here, Black Liberation Media, for episode technically 87 of Saturdays with Renee, featuring Renee and Jared Ball. My internet is not cooperating, and I was the one underprepared, so this is my fault. But welcome back, everybody. Renee, how are you on this fine Saturdays on a Monday?
We have to do like it's not sad something. We got to figure something out. Since
not Saturdays,
we be doing this.
Not. Yeah.
Since we be just randomly popping up on a non-Saturday.
But also, in part, I need to apologize because it was me not being clear with the schedule. I didn't let folks know on the show this morning. I didn't have the stream set up. So to the remixers, it's my fault you weren't given a sufficient notification. I apologize to Renee. I apologize to our guest, and but I look forward to a strong recovery and rebound. Yeah, here we go. Any day with Renee.
Oh. There we go. That's a good one. All right, so y'all gonna have to like and share. Please send the word out that we randomly are going live. This has been it is a little bit off schedule intentionally, because with the guests that we have going and with the program that Feed Durham has going, it was gonna be too late to push the show to when we had a free Saturday, because we've got shows booked out now for a few weeks. And so we were given, we were thinking, what's the best way to do it? Do it when it's going to be least convenient for people who could benefit from the program, or go off schedule. So we opted to go off schedule. And I think I think that was the best plan. And then, because, on this end of things, our goal is to always share when we get news of organizations and people who are doing the real work. And so I don't think we need to delay any at all. We can just get going as long as Katina's ready, and then we'll roll.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on.
Very excited. Thank you so much for joining. Katina Parker is here from Feed Durham. Katina, our process when we have guests is to allow them to introduce themselves. So if you want to say hello to the audience and let folks know who you are, where you're from, what you do, and then we'll go from there.
My name is Katina Parker. I live on unceded Occaneechi land in a place called Durham, North Carolina. And I'm originally from Oklahoma. I'm Black and First Nations, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chippewa, and Seminole. I've lived a bunch of different places, including Wilmington, Delaware, and Los Angeles, and now here. My formal background is filmmaking, writing, photography, and later in life, I became an organizer at the national level. I've also worked as a journalist for many years. Actually, for most of my adult life, I've worked as a journalist off and on. Most notably in Ferguson, embedded with Ferguson activists, and also embedded within the BLM movement during the early days, embedded within Standing Rock, embedded within several LGBTQ movements, and also here in Durham, where a lot of good things happen that ripple out across the country. I had the good fortune of being present and filming the day that they pulled down the first Confederate statue here in Durham. So been somewhere and seen some things. Got into food work during 2020, shut down. Film career was popping. I have 10 projects in production still, and those projects were in production 5 years ago, many of them. And once it became obvious that we weren't going anywhere for a while, I had a choice. My first mind was to spend a lot of time with my archive. Got about 40 years of photos, mini DV, every format of visual media. Um, and it's an archive that matters. I've covered Million Man, Million Woman, all those marches, covered Black art and musicianship for many years, Black organizing for decades. So my first mind was to spend a lot of time with that archive and to get caught up. As a traveling artist, there's a lot of things that can go awry at home and they get undone, or they don't get done, I should say. And then Spirit put it on my mind to gather people, to feed them, mostly because every June I hosted a barbecue, a cookout at my home, called Cousin Palooza, where I would rent a big old bounce house and, have the slip and slides and, just blackety black it up. We play spades on church pews and have a great time. And as I did the math, like many of us, I began to realize all these annual traditions that were not going to happen that year in 2020. And so at first, the cooking was a way to recreate that annual event that so many of us had come to look forward to here in Durham. And then my daughter, as I was thinking about other things that we were not going to be able to continue, my daughter was very interested in helping unhoused people. And we had started doing some work locally. And when I realized we weren't going to be able to serve within that setting anymore because those spaces had become closed off to the public, we decided that we would cook for some of the places where we had been serving before. And initially, we said that we would cook for, I want to say 400. But there was an issue with the mission that we chose, meaning that they had some questionable reputation within the community, and were rumored to be anti-gay. And so I had a conversation with the director of volunteers there, and he swore me up and down, no, that's not the case. Da, da, da. He even pointed me to his Black gay assistant who had come through their residency program to assure me that that was not the case. Kind of like when white folks show you their Black friend. And and I said, well, as long as you all are comfortable with the food being prepared by the hands of happy homos, then we're good, right? Because what was clear to me was, like, we're not going to hide who is preparing this food, who's serving, who is willing to make, the physical sacrifice of their personal safety, which at the time would have been COVID, in order to help people. And so that's kind of sort of how Feed Durham began. That's today's story. If you ask me tomorrow, I might have some other details. But the first time we cooked, we wound up cooking for upwards of 1,000 in order to settle concerns about this particular entity to which I had already committed. We had to add other partners who had better reputations in the community. And my thing is this: those folks may have that reputation, but we still come through that space. And the food that we were cooking was made with love and great intentionality. So that food still needed to reach our folks. It still needed to reach our Black and brown, brothers and sisters who are trying to get back on their feet. We thought that the first cookout would take 2 days. I think it took 5 or 6. And the food overall was good, but we made a lot of mistakes and then just kept reinventing this cookout every 5 or 6 weeks for several years until we had great mastery and finally arrived at a place where at our height, we were cooking for about 2,000 a day. But if we were to reconfigure at this time, we could cook for tens of thousands a day just off of steam pots due to our training and a lot of the hardiness testing that we endured in order to cook. And I'll say this last piece and then I'll break so that you all can ask questions and direct your podcast as you see fit. But a lot of times you can't tell people where things are going. For years, I tried to tell people, for 10 years, I tried to tell people that this time was coming and that we needed to prepare. And there were definitely people who were already like-minded and heading in the direction of making sure that they were growing their own food, making sure that they could live off the land, making sure that they were attuned to nature, that sort of thing. But by and large, people just didn't want to hear it. And they would say, stop, Katina, you're scaring folks. And then, COVID hit. and we began to see the writing on the wall. And, many of us, Black and brown folks, began preparing in earnest. Many of us did begin growing our own food. Some of us went off grid. Some of us became very nomadic and got RVs and traveled the country. Some of us left the country. And then some of us acquired huge swaths of land that now serve as hubs for all kinds of things, like retreats to learn plant medicine and whatnot. But we're here now, and it's very clear that this government intends to re-enslave us. And there are a lot of folks who are scared. Mostly I find it's white liberals. When it comes to Black folks, I find that by and large, those of us who are rural are already prepared. Those of us who live in cities are semi-prepared just due to the hectic pace of city life. And my vested interest is in making sure that as many of us are able to eat as possible, so that we can stay present for the fight. And in providing blueprints and tips and physical resources for people to grow their own food, there's also the opportunity in the tradition of Black Panthers to engage in political education and to bring those folks who have been fired due to DEI, bring those folks back into our community with resources so they can teach these collegiate level, master's level type classes that they were teaching in these traditional white institutions often enough. I said a lot.
No, that's good. That's what we needed you to lay it all out. I have a question, mostly based on how you just explained. You said the cookout lasted for days. Can you explain like how that works? What you mean by were you just like shifting and cooking for 5 days straight? Can you
Yes.
clarify that? Oh,
yes. So the background is this. I come from cooking people, but did not consider myself a chef. My grandfather is a master barbecue chef. So is my mother. And I was around it and picked it up osmotically. It turns out I learned the hard way that I know how to set up, manage, and break down an outdoor kitchen during the course of this. The inspiration for the work was at least threefold. There's the work that I saw consistently being done in my home community, Green Pastures, Oklahoma, where majority Black town, before desegregation, one school called Dungy donated on land called Parker Heights by my great-great-grandfather. And that community was so insular, so tight. We never went hungry. We were never hot. Well, we were hot. It's Oklahoma. We were never cold. We were always dressed well. We didn't know we were poor until we, got up and left those spaces for higher education. Some of us, because we were so well loved and tended to, we're talking 100+ year old mutual aid network where everybody grew their own food. Most folks had farm animals for a variety of purposes, for work, and sometimes for slaughter as well. And when something went wrong or something was needed, you really didn't have to make any phone calls because the community was so tight and connected. If somebody died, folks would just show up at your house with food. You need money to send your kid to school. People would collect at church and bring the money to you. Something happened, Oklahoma is a particularly racist part of the country. Everywhere is racist, but racism in Oklahoma and Missouri and northern Texas looks a particular way. There's a reason why Oklahoma, out of all the states, had the most Black towns in the Union. At one point, there were more than 50 Black towns. But yes, if something happened and, one of your people was being targeted by white folks for lynching, then you quickly pull money in the community and send them to the next place so that they could get away. And that exists to this day. I'm still deeply involved in my community of origin, even though I live elsewhere. I help organize the all-school reunion that happens for that Black school that has since closed. And that tradition lives very strongly in me. My approach to people is very much from mostly these Black women, these giants who, on one hand, they fed us every Sunday through church and through other activities. But these folks also integrated the state of Oklahoma. A woman named Clara Luper, a woman named Nancy Davis. Clara Luper started the sit-in movement as we know it in America. Greensboro is often credited, but the sit-in movement in earnest began in Oklahoma on August 19th, 1958. From them, I understand that the civil rights movement, the winds of the civil rights movement, were only possible because of these decades old, sometimes centuries old mutual aid networks that existed in our communities, because of segregation, but also because of the community minded ethos that Black and Native folks bring to village life, to community life. So I stand on that tradition. And then years later in Ferguson, Mama Cat, a woman named Kathy Daniels, every Sunday she would host a cookout in the parking lot at the tire shop across the street from Ferguson PD. And if you don't know, what happened in Ferguson has become the longest running, how do they say it? I'm at a loss for words, but basically, it exceeded the Montgomery bus boycott in terms of length. The protest did. It was every day. There was always somebody outside of Ferguson Police Department protesting, no matter how cold, no matter how hot it was. Sometimes it would just be one person, but they would move in shifts. And on Sundays, Mama Cat would come with her little griddle and her portable setup, and she's one of those people who bakes and makes these.
Is that me or did she freeze?
No, she
Oh,
froze.
okay.
Oh, there we
Okay,
go.
hold on
There
a
we
second.
go.
There we go. Yeah.
We got you back. We got you back.
Where did I leave off?
Just at the last thing you were saying, we didn't miss, I think,
Okay.
almost anything.
I was saying that Mama Cat would come on Sundays with her griddle set up and with her deluxe airbrush cakes and feed the protesters, so it became a gathering spot. And then a couple years later, when I was in Standing Rock, before any of us went, you would check in with your friends who had already gone. And they would always say, make sure you go to Mama Winona's kitchen. Mama Winona was legendary for feeding the protesters in the Ocheti Shakoan camp, which is where I resided. And then actually, after the statue came down here in Durham, the Klan said they were going to march that following Friday. I think it came down on a Monday. So let's see, Charlottesville happened on August 10th, Saturday. Okay. So Charlottesville happened on the same day that was the 1-year anniversary of Mike Brown's murder, right? And then a couple of days later, Durham pulls down that was a Saturday. And then a couple of days later, Durham pulls down the first Confederate statue. And we find out that these statues are hollow. It becomes, an allegory, if you will. It buckles at the knees. It's so easy to pull down that a child is actually on the rope line that pulls this thing down. And then a few days later, the Klan says that they're going to march and protest here in Durham. That was the following Friday. Thousands of counter protesters poured into the streets for hours. And remember, this is August, so it's Durham. It's very hot, very humid. And folks were just out there occupying the space, letting them know that they were not welcome. And there were a handful of clanny types that showed up. They weren't in their hoods or anything like that. But you got to remember, this is during the time of the Confederate flag wars. This is, around the time that Bree Newsom pulls down that flag. This is around that time that within city councils and all these state level government meetings, we are pushing to have this Confederate flag symbolism removed from everyday life, right? So we're in a culture war. After several hours of being out there, I believe I was filming, folks started handing out water, and the people handing out water were not known to us. People have become so thirsty that they were accepting water from strangers. And I became very concerned about the possibility of folks being poisoned. And so jump to 2020, when the devil's work, which is what I call him, when the devil's work starts futzing around with messaging around COVID, confusing people about what we should and shouldn't be doing, around COVID, it became obvious to me that he intended to manipulate the election by making sure as many people as possible were sick, and particularly us, confused about whether they could leave the house or not, but also just scared to be in public space in order to vote. And I just got this feeling that we were going to need this skill set, that we were going to need as many people as possible to know how to cook in protest settings and to know how to cook in encampments, which is how, in earnest, Feed Durham began. And so when you ask about multi-day cookouts, it was to give folks the feeling of cooking in an encampment. And, as I said earlier, sometimes you can't tell folks everything. Like, I understood the trajectory and where we needed to be. And they trusted me enough, these hundreds of volunteers, to show up in my yard and to endure heat, to endure, profound cold, to cook through tropical storms and hurricanes. And in that process, we became much hardier together, and also learned a lot. Like there are some wildly smart people who show up in these volunteer spaces if you just take enough time to talk to them. Horticulturalists, environmental scientists, people who love compost, folks who travel with circular saws and all kinds of strange welding kits, all kinds of strange equipment in their cars. In these multi-day cookouts, which would run, our first shift started at 6 a.m. and sometimes we didn't finish until 4 a.m. And at that time, we were able to have a sunrise shift because nobody went to work, really. So there would be, 20, 30 people out in my yard. And I should say all this stuff happens in my yard for the most part. All of the prep happens on 1 acre in a part of East Durham, one very generous acre. But yeah, people would travel in from Chicago, Baltimore, Atlanta, Richmond in particular, Charlotte, and they would stay for days to study and learn the process and take it back to their respective communities.
That's awesome.
I just wanted to pull up some of these images, if nothing else, from the article that was sent, this photo essay, Standing in the Gaps with Feed Durham, and I'll make sure the link is in the show description also.
And is that you behind the grill in the picture?
Go on, scroll back up so people can see me on the there. Hey, you see the char, you already understand what's happening.
Right.
The food is indeed tasty.
Making it difficult to be a vegan. I could just tell from the picture. It's a struggle. That looks delicious.
Well, we make a number of vegan dishes that most people don't
Talk
know
about it. Talk about it.
I now host a community dinner on Wednesdays at my house, and then we transition into planting seeds and, for gardens for folks. And pretty much every meal we cook is vegan, and folks don't even know it's vegan.
That's what I'm talking about. Oh, look how good that looks. Oh.
Yes. We call that a beauty plate.
Say that again. You call it a what?
We call it a beauty plate. So what you have here, you have charred broccoli, charred garlic broccoli. There's a smashed yam. That long orange piece, that's a carrot steak on a griddle. There's some butternut squash. I believe that was the sweet version. When you sear butternut squash with coconut oil and a little bit of cinnamon, just a tiny bit of nutmeg and a little bit of sea salt, it tastes so good. It's almost like a sweet potato. But my favorite accomplishment was taking the clean dirt taste out of beets. I am not someone who has the palate for beets. And I found a way to make these beets. It's called roasted beets tropical, and I'll give y'all the recipe. What we do is, of course, you wash the beets, put them on a smoker with a flavored wood of your liking. I tend towards sweet woods for something like beets, so an apple wood. I'm probably not gonna do hickory. Hickory's just a little too strong, but an apple wood, might do a pear wood, something like that. And you put the beets in a foil pan and seal them completely with just a little bit of water inside, and you cook them until they're soft, and then you slice them. Well, you take them off and you slice them, and then with a little bit of coconut oil, some pineapple juice, sea salt, just a tiny bit of thyme, a little bit of black pepper, and agave. You create a mix and you put it back on the fire, on the smoker with no foil, so that it will crisp and harden and char just a little bit. When I tell you that it is a treat,
I've timestamped this, and I hope my loving wife is hearing any of this, because she has infused beets into our diet at the house, and there's some struggle with it. I think this would be a very helpful way. So thank you for that.
The beets are masterful. They're really good at helping our bodies recover, particularly from overwork and extra activity. They clean out your intestines. I know I'm going off track, but this is what it is. This is actually the word. 90% of your immune system is in your intestines, and so it's important to keep your intestines flushed out as much as possible. Beets do that for you in spades. They boost your immune system. They're antioxidants. They do so many things. They're also anti-aging. They slow down the aging process.
Beets, I'm telling you,
is it going to help? Is it going to help Jared's memory?
Nope.
You know what could? Sniffing rosemary.
There's a lot to overcome, though. Let's not put all that work on rosemary when it comes to my memory. There's a lot to overcome. So folks, definitely take her up on the advice there, but I don't know if it's the solution for your boy.
They say that for elders with dementia, you can help them out by giving them rosemary to basically inhale. Help rosemary is supposed to help stimulate memory. Jared, will you scroll back up to the cornucopia image? No, back down. The picture with the chips.
Sorry.
A little further down.
Wait.
Past the beauty plate.
Sorry. This one. This
right here. Yes. Yep. So this is important to say. We started out cooking for all those folks, and for the first 2 years, that was a very effective strategy. Once folks got vaccinated, people were not available for the multi-day cookouts. And so we continued to cook, a few times a year, but much smaller scale, maybe 1 or 2 days for a special event, or if somebody called us in, like local water protectors would sometimes call us in if they were going to have a march around a pipeline protest, and we would cook for maybe 100, right? We shifted more towards moving resources, which is the lane where we have truly excelled. We've cooked roughly 60,000 meals at this point, right? And while that's a gigantic number, I like to call us a jam band, like one of those small 3-person bands that makes so much sound. It's a gigantic number, but one of the things that we were trying to figure out is how we reduce overall needs so that we don't have to cook as much, right? And it became obvious that there are all these resources sitting in places, in warehouses, in restaurants, so on and so forth, that are available to us and don't reach our people because there's a lack of relationship and also a lack of strategic know-how. So to access these resources, whether it's at a gas station, which gas stations they have to throw out their food every night around 7. Those hot dogs, the pizza, the da-da-da-da. It's not food that you and I should be eating, Jared, but it is at our age, but it's food that could really benefit a young family, right? And so gas stations, restaurants, grocery stores, these grocery stores with all these power grid issues, when the refrigerators go offline, they take that food, and the same people who stock those shelves and who cannot afford the food that they're stocking on the shelves, understand, these same folks are tasked with taking that food out of the refrigerators and placing it in dumpsters. Like, how cruel could you be, right? And there's a way to circumvent all of that. It's by forming relationships with the managers at these venues. With grocery stores, most managers have a quarterly budget for how much they can give to community, right? And in certain places, folks aren't even tapping into that because they don't have the knowledge to know that those programs exist. But also in forming relationships with grocery store managers, meaning, you're on a first name basis. These folks will call you, they'll text you, maybe on the low, depending on the corporate policy, but they will text you to say, we're about to put all this food in the dumpster. Can you come get it? Right. And then you just have your volunteer base ready to spring. When there's a power outage, you know that they're going to have to get rid of the food. So you can already have people on tap, waiting to go and pick it up. You just got to coordinate the pickup time. Right. And often enough, these goods exchange hands in exchange for a tax receipt. Right. Now, it's important to pair whoever the pickup person is. Like, it has to be the right pickup, meaning some of these places need you to come with a box truck so you can push up to a loading dock. And if that's the setup, you need folks who are punctual. You can't have the folks who are 15, 30 minutes late and always got a story for why they're late. It has to be somebody who can land it within a 15-minute window, because loading docks are very active. But through those types of relationships, we move 20,000 pounds of food every month from Happy Dirt Organics without any effort, meaning we just send a box truck on Fridays. They load it with a forklift, several pallets, and then one of our partners, Community Health Coalition, they're now responsible for the pickup. So they'll do the massive pickup because they feed about 300 Black households. And then I'll just send them a short list requesting some sort of breakdown for some of the smaller groups that we support. They feed 20, 30 people. So I'll just say, okay, y'all take all of this. I just need you to pull of the 100 boxes of produce that you picked up. I need you to pull 10 boxes and drop it off at this location so that these folks can pick it up. And then they take the other 90 boxes and distribute it to mostly Black elders and Black families.
Is this the relationship you have with these distributors here that you just described with
Yes.
these food outlets? Yeah, right on. Okay.
Yes,
right on.
these are some of the folks with which we've worked. So Gaia Herbs is an international herb supplement company. Come on, brain, come on, help me. I got 50-year-old brain too.
You gotta go smell some rosemary. You gotta start sniffing the rosemary.
What's the white man who used to play the football for the Patriots and he left, the quarterback?
Tom Brady.
Giselle. So Giselle is the spokesperson. Thank you for helping me. Giselle is the spokesperson for Gaia Herbs. They're based here in North Carolina. You want to find these companies that are based in your home state because they have a vested interest in terms of public relations and giving back. So Gaia Herbs is based here in North Carolina. Big Spoon Roasters. If you go to Whole Foods and you see those $12, $13 jars of luxury nut butters, that's Big Spoon Roasters. You want to find those entities and create those relationships. And then, yes, they always want a tax receipt. So you have to have 501c3 status or a fiscal sponsor who will issue a tax receipt to them in exchange for the donations.
Now, that's not always so simple, because I can recall in New York, because that's how they do, like the police being there guarding the food that has been thrown out to make sure that people can't access the food out of the dumpster.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going as far as throwing soap and detergent on, like, just wildly, like, y'all would prefer to waste your money than to let somebody eat who can't afford to shop in your store. Do you find that that's ever something you encounter, that people are just like, nah, I'm good wasting food and wasting money, we don't want to help? Or has it just been that because of the work that you've put in and the relationships that you've kind of fostered over this time, that you're not really encountering that too much?
Location matters and city size matters. So Feed Durham is able to flourish because of the type of community ethos that defines Durham. City spaces, the more metropolitan spaces, the harder it is to organize around food. First of all, just the sheer amount of concrete and the impact of concrete on climate make it harder to organize around food. So yes, it is true that certainly 10 to 15 years ago, 10 to 20 years ago, I would say, there was a cruelty that was happening in many inner city spaces around available food resources and dumpsters where they would do things like, pour bleach on the food and whatnot. But, and life has become so difficult for so many over the last 5 to 6 years that we've seen a lot of that shift. Like, we now have community fridges all across the country, and that still remains a shock to me, for a number of reasons. There was a time when community fridges just would not have been able to exist, I would say before 2020, 2019. But collectively, folks understand that we're in big trouble if we let too many people go hungry. And then that points us to a question, or an observation, that in places like America, there's an acceptable number of people who can go hungry, right? There's a tipping point, like there's a sense of a tipping point in terms of, like, once we reach this threshold, there's going to be massive chaos if we allow this many people to go hungry. And so I say all that to say that there has been a shift, even in some of these harder city spaces where the bleach was being poured, where the food was being poisoned. And those cruelties do still exist, but they don't exist to the same extent and to the same degree. With what's coming, shelves going empty, the likelihood that they'll declare martial law, all these things feel possible again. And in general, people in city centers, I advise that that we have exit strategies. Where can you go so that there's some land? Because in addition to being landlocked and isolated often enough in these city centers, even if there's water all the way around you, when I say landlocked, I mean just the inability to grow your own food, to practice autonomy around resourcing your own food. The more concentrated we are in number, the easier we are to control, through violence, through disruption of supply chain, through attacks on power grids, and that sort of thing.
Interesting.
Did I answer your question?
You did. No, you did. And I just, I was really just curious, and it makes sense to me that it would be dependent on location. I still see an immense amount of cruelty up here, and so it's not. I wish it did feel reduced in my, like, actual, like, visual of what I see stores and people doing. But I'm also a person who just can't understand why people are okay with people starving. Like, I never, it's never made sense to me that you would be a person who would be okay with watching someone else not have, and just be okay with that. So, but that's my own thing. So
I want to say cities have a way of dehumanizing us and making us anonymous. There's the undercurrent of connection living in cities, right? But there are also all these ways in which we're taught to ignore and distance ourselves from certain people. For many years before I started this work, I was a street photographer, and a real point of fascination and torment for me was the ways in which unhoused people in places like New York City could be sleeping on the ground and folks would step over them. Or, I once detected a what I believe was a male-bodied person sleeping amongst garbage bags in such a way that he looked like garbage, and people were sitting at the bus stop next to him, not even aware that he was there laying on the sidewalk. Also, it stressed me to think that the trash was going to be picked up and they could potentially just pick this person up and put him in the dumpster. And, they have the crushers in a lot of cities. But folks walked by that person for like, I sat out there for a long time just watching. Nobody ever realized that there was a human being laying amongst those bags. And that is just, it's astonishing to me.
I mean, I agree. And I think I think what you said was really important about being, this whole individualism, right? Like being taught to worry about yours, what you have, making sure you got your bag, making sure you got the stuff that you need, and to be completely desensitized to the needs of other people, of the greater population, of the broader, liberation of people, like just not really understanding that connection between, just because you have something, it doesn't make it okay that multiple exponential people don't have it. Like to be able to see that and just be like, oh, I'm good. Like I've got mine. I don't need to worry about other people is always something that I thought um was
Wild.
wild. Yeah.
And
It's just
the
wild.
attendant part of that is that even the more aggressive part of that is the side of the narrative of formation that says if you are in those conditions, it's your fault.
Right.
So I don't have to take any
Right.
heed or have any concern because you just didn't take advantage of all of this endless opportunity here.
Right.
Uh, yeah, I did.
Jim, one of the
Yeah,
most fascinating things I've learned, I thought I knew white people because I've spent a lot of time in white institutions. I was tracked early for a certain type of higher education because of the way that I tested. I was one of the few Black kids in the 80s and 90s who tested well. And I really thought that I knew white folks, but it continues to floor me. One of the things I learned from our volunteers is that within white spaces, not rural spaces necessarily, but within white spaces, they blame one another for being poor. And it becomes more of a competition, like Hunger Games, right? Like it's and then so it's your fault you're poor. It's you didn't do. And like that's not all white spaces because there are plenty of white rural communities that practice mutual aid. But in some, like if you are on the bottom, it's your fault. Whereas in Black and brown spaces, we understand why folks are on the bottom. We understand why folks are struggling, right? And we may even have answers for how to help them, but typically lack the resources to do the level of work that is needed to repair our communities. When you think about the times that we're living in and understand that in order to survive what's coming, we all have to be like all hands on deck, and that we have to activate these stores of untapped human potential, like all these niche groups that live at the periphery of society because they have abandoned America or America's abandoned them. Um, there's a huge task ahead. Like if we're inviting white folks into mutual aid work, not necessarily ours, but understanding like white folks have to have their own mutual aid work that they're doing for one another, but also there has to be some anti-racist organizing, anti-class organizing happening within that work, because otherwise the Hunger Games just keep getting recreated, right? And often enough, some of these folks want to come to our spaces or want to participate in fusion spaces, fusion organizing spaces with us, but our orientation to poverty is just so different. When I see impoverished folks, I'm thinking about what we're losing. I'm thinking about what that person could be doing, Black, white, whatever, what that person could be doing for the planet if they had the resources and support that they needed, right? Because we have so many problems that need to be solved right now. We have so many problems that are created by capitalism, by the Hunger Games of capitalism. And we truly need all hands on deck. So elders who have been pushed to the side, young people, these youth groups that are always wanting to do service, disabled communities, so on and so forth.
It's interesting because we make fun a lot of people who who actually are Black people who think that poorness within Black communities is the fault of Black people because we spend too much money on hair tracks and Adidas sneakers and bags and
That ain't it.
cars. And we know that's not it. That's why we make fun of them.
That ain't it, y'all. That's
Yeah, right. Oh,
Mhm.
we're 100%. I just it's a conversation we actually have a lot when we see this rotating conversation of Black capitalism and Black business and the buying power. I don't know if you're familiar with Jared's book on Black buying power. Look, I had to bring it up. And so, like this whole notion of, we can somehow pull our bootstraps way up and get out of this situation that has been created by a capitalist system that is literally just in place to make sure that people can't be okay and can't survive. So I think, could you talk a little more about the mutual aid aspect of the work? And I know that I think you have a whole program to show people how to grow and how to access, food autonomy, that type of thing. Could you talk a little bit more about that part of the program?
Yes. First, I want to reinforce what you're saying. We aren't poor because it's our fault. We are poor because every 20, 30 years, there have been pointed attacks that undermine our ability to create generational wealth, particularly the Jim Crow laws. Like Black folks were thriving during the late 1800s. Our communities were thriving during the late 1800s. And white folks were in a very difficult financial position. And when the government couldn't actually offer them money, they offered them, the hierarchy of white supremacy, like that became inculcated in American culture even further, right? And so these, what we call racial pogroms, precursors to what we now call riots, there were all these pogroms. We know about Rosewood, we know about Tulsa, but there were dozens and dozens of situations where white folks became jealous of the wealth we were building amongst one another, simply because we lived in segregation, meaning your laws made it such that we have to live amongst each other. So naturally we pool our resources and we pay one another, and we're building wealth because the dollar stays in our community, all that sort of thing. And then they got mad at the result of that and burnt our stuff down, and shot us up. And so when you have that happening every generation in one way or another, when, in contemporary times, it's, that we make $10,000 to $50,000 less than our white counterparts in the workplace, right? Like when you have those kind of hits just always coming, it's very difficult to build. I'm not going to say wealth, because I question what wealth is in contemporary times, but it's difficult to build stability in terms of resources, shared resources, but more importantly, emotional and mental stability that you can pass down to your children. Fortitude. It disrupts fortitude. In terms of mutual aid, I don't like to start out with a negative. I'm fighting against the worry right now. Young white anarchists and radicals have whitewashed mutual aid as we know and understand it. We have these generations old mutual aid networks, depending on the cities from which your families come from. Sorry to end in a preposition. The first Black mutual aid network in the US is documented as the Free African Society, which was in the 1700s, right? And then we go on to have these mutual aid and benefit societies throughout the South in particular, but definitely throughout the North too. And these are the traditions that got us the winds of the civil rights movement. So often within progressive circles, white folks in particular can get really vengeful about Black wins, right? Like when I was working at GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, Prop 8, marriage equality was being organized against by the George W. Bush administration. There was a campaign to buy Black churches. Millions and millions of dollars were moved into our churches with the understanding that the churches, that the Black churches by and large had held down the civil rights movement. And these churches were bought, and they were advised to no longer teach or advance social justice missions, right? This becomes important to like current mutual aid efforts. And instead of teaching social justice, instead of being homes for social justice, they were encouraged to preach prosperity politics, right? Prosperity spiritualities, which is how you get, dare I say, the Potter's house, and some of these mega churches that are more about the wealth that you can amass, and they also do some social good in the community. But these are not the spaces where people are going to gather to organize against police brutality. These are not the churches where people are going to gather to organize for Black political candidates who can actually get us the services and the policies that we need to thrive. Um, our version of mutual aid is wraparound community care. The version of mutual aid that happens right now is very much focused singularly on food. And what I see is a lot of young white folks who, um, I also want to say this generational thing that most of the young people I know in their 20s, Black, white, or in between, don't have significant relationships with folks who are 20, 30 years older than them. They, for whatever, no aunties, no big brothers, big sisters. And so there's some real differences culturally between who they are in their 20s and who we may have been in our 20s. Like when I was in my 20s, I was keeping court with, Maya Angelou and Sonia Sanchez and these heavy hitters, and I could do it because I had the social training to do so. But these young folks don't have that, and so it means that they do a lot of organizing work, but their organizing tends to be slow in terms of impact and more focused on the power they can build together, and a lot less focused on the power they can build with the people that they call themselves serving. And so that's a lot of words to say. I see a lot of folks talking about mutual aid, and really it's just the rebranding of charity and handouts. It's the same old scheme, it's the same old game. It's people who know where there's a significant amount of resource, sitting in a warehouse, and they don't like the idea of it going bad, right? And so they organize amongst themselves to move that resource into a community that needs it. But because of implicit bias, and because, by and large, white folks really just aren't comfortable with us in our culture. Like they like to gobble up the things that feel good and make them feel free and make them feel wild, or, whatever attachments they have to Black culture. But I have found in my own work that there's a real resistance to honoring the protocols, the layers of protocols and teaching that make that culture possible, the culture that they gobble up. And so my push these days around mutual aid is making sure that people understand mutual aid is more than food. Mutual aid is more than moving resources. Mutual aid is actually it's based in relationship. And that really is all that it is. So in relationship, Renee, Jared, I know you, I know your family, I know your kids. I know that, I'm going to make this up, but Jared has a son that wants to go to Morehouse. And because I know that Jared's son wants to go to Morehouse, I'm going to reach out to my friends, Saul and Martin, and, a couple other people I know who went to Morehouse to see if we can't help get them in. Right. And then I also know that Jared's little girl needs a pair of roller skates. And my daughter just outgrew some roller skates. So I'm going to slide in the roller skates. And then Jared knows that I really like these crowns. You know what I mean? I don't need another crown, but maybe he sees something at someplace and he picks it up. Like that is what mutual aid actually is. It's the joy of supporting one another's dreams and accessing resources in support of one another's dreams. So whether it's food, whether it's helping somebody get an opportunity, whether it's, giving somebody a ride to work, because you know how much his job is going to help them get situated. That is what mutual aid is. What we move is an incidental expression of our love for one another, our care for one another, and our willingness to support one another's dreams.
If we can just a slight and loving, as they say, pushback on just a little bit of the rendition of the history that you broke down, like around here, whether it's my work or I was just talking to her earlier, I'm wishing her a belated happy birthday, Erica Brown, future Dr. Erica Brown on Brokish, which just dropped. its new season, or Two Black and Laundering Black Rage, or the interviews we've done with Ebony Reed and Louise Story in their book 15 Cents on the Dollar, or Marisa Baradaran's work, stuff we've referenced a lot around here. And the criticism of the mythologizing around the benefits of segregation, and as I think you said earlier, that we were doing well as a community before the pogroms and all of that. And a lot of that, including the myth of the circulating dollar, is just that, mythologized into this idea that Black communities were actually doing better, when in reality there was a handful of a Black bourgeoisie that were doing better, relatively speaking, and have really been part of the problem in supporting the mythology, because at the end of the day, what gets supported is not revolutionary political organization, but this idea that Black capitalism and Black entrepreneurialism and business is a solution. So, for instance, just lastly, Two Black and others have pointed this out, that the real destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa was not the pogroms of the white racists, as bad as that were, but it was the federal policy 20 years later, with the government rezoning and highway, driving highways through communities and all of this. That's what really has destroyed even the Black business community in these spaces, by disconnecting them from their consumer base. So I know some in our chat were realizing this, and I didn't want to leave that contradiction of our sort of collective, somewhat platform, and certainly my own disagreement with that bit of the history. That said, I think to the point that you largely were at least returning to, as I understood it, that there needs to be more done among Black communities and allies to overcome these contradictions and struggles. So I just wanted to put that out there and encourage you and others to continue engaging with us around those discussions. But yeah,
first of all, I missed the chat because I'm kind of new to StreamYard. I was wondering, I said, where's all the comments? And then finally, because I stopped speaking, I figured it out. So it's fun to see what people have been saying. I appreciate all the high fives. Jared, I don't know that you and I are saying the same thing.
Okay.
And I'm because I don't believe in the Black bourgeoisie. I actually think the Black bourgeoisie is very vulnerable right now and is dangerous. And in my personal life, I've pulled back from people who move in those spaces. When I say Black bourgeoisie, I think of people who have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo because they benefit from it. And the folks that I am struggling with within Black bourgeoisie space are folks who are very white adjacent and who don't believe in self-defense. That inability, that unwillingness to defend oneself, meaning like allowing oneself to be defanged by white supremacy in a way that is unnatural and really only serves white folks' need to feel safe and comfortable around us, is very distressing, disturbing for me. As somebody who comes from gun-owning, gun-toting folks, in places like Oklahoma, where our arsenals are what have kept us safe over the many decades. When I'm speaking from personal experience, coming from these Black towns, coming from green pastures, coming from Boley, Oklahoma. And what I'm speaking to is not about Black bourgeoisie. It is about Black folks who, like I said, when we were growing up, we didn't know we were poor. That's not Black bourgeoisie. That's us looking out for one another in such a way that we feel cared for and are not wanting for a lot of material things. We spend a lot of our time outside playing with animals, exploring, doing that sort of thing. And I can say, I don't know what was happening in the rest of the country, but I can say that in Oklahoma, not so much the benefits of segregation. That's one way to look at it. I come from Marooner people. I come from people who chose to live amongst one another for the sake of our own safety. And that wasn't about financial benefit. It was about what made the most sense for us in terms of ensuring our culture and our safety. That feels different than what you're describing. But but I also see and understand what you're describing.
No, I'm not. All I was really saying was that I'm not criticizing the segment of the community you're talking about. I'm talking about the business elite, the Black business community that has wanted to promote the mythology around the Wall Street and the success and the benefits of a segregated economy and a recirculating black dollar and all of this. These are not realities in terms of how wealth is created, how the Black community could evolve its or benefit or reach parity or have liberation. And they're often promoted by the Black capitalist bourgeoisie, because they like this mythology that if you come and support my business, you are engaging in liberation activity, and we're gonna free ourselves. And I know that's so. When I heard it, I just wanted to. That was it. But I got you. Thank you.
I really like this comment. Mutual aid isn't hoagie distribution and fix-a-flats for Blacks. Because that's one of the most frustrating things that I see happening within these mostly white-led mutual aid spaces. Like, you saw the quality of food that we're offering people. And that's something that I've been pushing within our organizing community. I feed people like you have come to my table. I don't care where you are and when you are. And I don't play around food. The animals gave their lives. The plants gave their lives so that we could go forth and do our work. And folks who are vegetarian and vegan, I'm native, so in my world, plants have life. Rocks even have life. They have life force, and the plants don't cry any less because you pluck them from the earth. Then animals feel anxiety potentially, depending on how you slaughter them. Like, all of it is needing and deserving of what I call spiritual adornment, which for me is the spices, it's the seasoning. And for the chicken, we pour we form a marinade that we call a spiritual bath. But it is that, it is transforming the energy that those chickens may have experienced while they were living, because often enough the source of our food, of our chicken, has been like these chicken farms, right? When we were dealing with them. And so the energy of how that chicken lived has to be transformed in order for it to enter our bodies. You can taste biochemistry. And when an animal has lived in fear versus when an animal has lived joyful and free, it makes a difference in your dining experience, so to speak. And so I say all that to say that for many of us, food is ritual. And these are also some qualitative cultural differences that, in working with a number of white folks in my kitchen, a Black kitchen, there are conversations I have to have with them. Like, we don't throw food. I don't care how angry or tired or frustrated we are. The chicken didn't do anything to us. So what we're going to do is ground our energy and move this chicken into these trays, and we're going to put love into it. We're going to check whatever that energy is so that we can focus on pouring love into this food. That's a very different approach than folks who want to give you a bunch of bread from a bakery, when so many folks are gluten intolerant. And many of us who are gluten intolerant, it's believed that it's the pesticides and some of the additives that are placed in these grains in order to keep them pest free. So many of us are dairy free, so on and so forth. So mutual aid has to be catered to the needs of the people that you're serving. And sustainable mutual aid models have access points for everybody in the community. When I say that we're in a charity model, community fridges is an example. I recently saw with our local community fridges a post on their organizing platform inviting anybody to go and clean the fridges, which is hella dangerous. Basically show up with your cleaning supplies and clean these fridges. Well, everybody don't clean the same, and everybody doesn't have good sense around, like taking the food out before you spray Clorox in it, all that sort of thing. But also, when the people who benefit from the fridges feel seen and in community with you, you don't have to organize a whole bunch of folks to clean the fridges, because those folks will clean the fridges themselves. because they value the service and whatnot. And so when we think about mutual aid, we really do need to focus on creating access points for people who we normally discount. Like in my world, unhoused folks have the greatest likelihood of surviving what's coming because they've already lived with discomfort and lived without leisure for a long time. They know every inch of a cityscape or a ruralscape. They know where to hide. They know like just every nook and cranny of places and spaces that we don't want to be. What some folks might call the mole people in New York City, the folks who live in the train system, who live underground in the train systems, right? But those like by no means am I calling anyone a cockroach, but I'm saying that people have been forced to live in like cockroach type settings, live as like those folks have the greatest chance of surviving what's coming because they've already survived so much. And in my like personal work, my interest is in aligning myself with as many unhoused folks as possible because they also are watchers. And traditionally, in Native and African culture, like there's space for watchers. There's space for the person who might be a little unwell, or who might be, by today's terms, might have temporal epilepsies or visions or whatever. And they have a role in our community sometimes, often as caretakers, but often as but also as people who keep an eye on things and let us know, what's going on, what we need to be paying attention to. So I would encourage all of us to do that work of decolonizing. Like when we talk about blaming people for their circumstances, often enough unhoused people are blamed for not being able to function in these circumstances that we all find overwhelming and challenging at times, and in circumstances that we're all under the threat of being broken by these circumstances at some point in our lives.
So I see my guy Pancho in the chat. Let me take this opportunity to maybe introduce you and some others to his great work of similar of a similar nature. This Food Autonomy in Chicago book. Ooh, did we just lose Katina? I think we just lost Katina.
We did. Oh no, there she is.
There she is. Okay, there she is. But this Food Autonomy in Chicago, which I'm still reading through, we did our first interview, which I expect to be a series with Pancho a couple weeks ago. But this is a great book that does seem to run along many of the parallels that you're talking about, Katina. So I just would want to encourage you to build, engage, and maybe mutually aid one another.
Hey, here we go. I'm with it.
There you go. Plug it.
That's kismet, because I was just talking to some of my Chicago comrades about Chicago's food systems and whatnot. So that's perfect.
All right. So I have one last question, and I don't know, Jared, if you have anything else that you kind of had.
I'm good. No, thanks. Yeah.
Laid out, but you made a point in the article to talk about the collective, which is multi-faith, multiracial, intergenerational, and that is such it's a struggle. I think a lot of people, we have these conversations about, like, you have to be careful who you let in. And I am one, of course, who I'm open to working with anybody as long as you can confirm that you're not going to bring harm into the community. So like, as long as you're not going to bring harm into the community, we can figure most things out. But I'm curious about the collective in general. If you could talk just a little bit before we let you go about, how this works, like how was your collective formed? How, like this whole idea of it being such like a tent, like how does that work out?
Feed Durham works the way that it does because I'm in Durham. Transparency. If I were in Oklahoma, if I were in a place like Oklahoma, where I'm predominantly in all Black space, then the work would look different. There would definitely be white treaty partners to the extent that it was necessary. But Feed Durham is a fusion politics space. And when you're organizing in a particular city, you have to lean into what is available. Um, I think it's incredibly important that that this work be led by Black and Brown folks who are time tested and proven quantities, unbought and unbossed, and who've been caping for us, for a long time, and that we yield to that type of leadership in shaping the ethos, but also contribute to the ethos that is being shaped. So, that's a lot of words to say. It doesn't always work. I just had to send a cease and desist to a young white organizer earlier today. Lately, I've been getting these white kids who were radicalized by Palestine and who have left their conservative families of origin for Durham. Durham is a progressive organizing mecca, if you will. People move here and then they send back for their other people, and so there's a lot of young energy in this city, and I find some of these young white folks fascinating. When you're willing to leave your family because you cannot take the racism anymore. Those are the kind of white folks with which I am interested in being aligned, but not all the time. Um, this person to whom I had to send the cease and desist allowed me to coin the term conscious Karen. This is somebody who came to my yard all of 2 times. We've had probably 50 events over the last 5 years, actually more than that now that we host the community dinners. And they wore a mask, which, masking optional. We wore masks up until last year. And we always wear masks when we are providing, like cooking and preparing food that is going to be offered to vulnerable populations. But for a number of reasons, we have relaxed on masking for the time being, mostly because of the heat and the risk to people like me I wear masks still, flying and that sort of thing. But masking in this environment where I have to drink 2 gallons of water a day, it created heart issues that I didn't have before COVID, right? And created some other, physical injuries. Like I tore my meniscus twice because I wasn't getting enough oxygen to my legs. Yeah. I'm an aging athlete. It's my biochemistry and how it works. But I find often with new to the fight white folks and even old to the fight white folks, they always want to be in charge, and will go off half cocked, and have no real sense of boundaries sometimes. And that's what happened with this particular young person. They started engaging in a back and forth with me around masking in the space, but ultimately it wasn't really about the safety of our folks. It was about them needing to be centered within our environment, right? It was about white people whiting, essentially. And I told them in very pointed terms, because they sent me this message saying that they stood in solidarity with Black and brown immunocompromised people, and essentially I didn't care about those people. And when I tell you, like, the gall, like the nerve, I was astonished. Like you know nothing about me, you know nothing about my track record, what I've sacrificed for my people, what I'm willing to give for my people. You also really don't understand how quickly I can cut you off, because like, the work is the work. And while I'm going back and forth with you, because I want to leave things in a good way, I've already told you I work a 90-hour week. I've already told you that engaging with you comes at the expense of other people eating. And so just relax. Like, if this isn't the right space for you, then move on to the next space. It wasn't about keeping people safe. It was about them wanting to feel heard and seen and da 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 da. And I don't have time for it. We don't have time for it. And so I keep my discernment sharp, and I'm upfront with white folks who want to be involved. I don't do tiny white hands. I don't do fragility. You have to be able to handle direct conversation. I'm not going to be skirting and skating around to tell you something. I'm going to, if you're in my kitchen, I'm going to treat you like you Black. Just short of smacking your hand because you touching things that you ain't supposed to touch. I'm going to treat you like you Black. And so, you know, when we're at the table having community dinner and homegirl shakes her hair out the table, I'm like, we don't do that. You know, you can't touch your hair at the table. The teaching of Black protocol in these spaces is so essential, and I encourage us to do it because often enough we ourselves have been closeted about our practices because we just don't want to deal with the judgment, the pushback, the heavy lift of explaining so much. But if we are going to organize with people who don't share the same cultural values and standards, we have to be willing to teach things that we may have been taught when we were 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And we have to be willing to do it in a way that's direct and that comes from a place of love, but also with the same sort of discipline and firmness. Like I tell white folks all the time, when I was growing up, didn't nobody tell me twice. There were too many kids in my family. You got told one time, and from there, you better figure it out. But it really was in your best interest when spoken to by an adult to get it good, and to move on to the next lesson. I hope I answered the question.
You did. I hear all of that.
But let me be really, my closest alliances are with Black women around this work, because what I found during the first couple of years that the folks who were doing the work that meant the most to me, it was these 1 or 2 person mom and pop type shops. Miss Marcella with the Mustard Seed Project, feeding people off of her Social Security card. A friend of mine, Allie J, she became a friend because she reached out asking for plates and she would feed unhoused people just as she was moving through the streets. This was a woman who was a single parent, in school, had a full-time job, feeding upwards of 90 unhoused people, every week. And so for me, the work with Feed Durham shifted quite critically during that time. And I decided that if we have access to all these resources, part of our mutual aid is not just about being in deep relationship with the people we serve, it's also being in deep relationship with the people who do the serving, right? And so one of the reasons we're able to feed so many people is through these partnerships with respected, trusted partners, typically Black women who've already been doing this work for so long. And then we're just coming in and bringing resource, quite frankly, through white adjacency, because white folks know where there are resources that Black folks don't typically know. And basically, we move the resources into their hands, into their storages, so they can move it into our community in the ways that make sense for our community. And these are folks who serve in spaces that nobody will go to. These are folks who serve in spaces with people who don't apply for or don't qualify for these food bank programs for a number of reasons. And sometimes transportation is the biggest reason, because you have to be able to get yourself to the food bank.
Right. Jared, did we miss anything? I'm gonna do our famous last. Is there anything you wanted us to ask that we didn't ask? Anything that you'd like to share? I know you said that there's a program. Part of the reason we kind of made sure we got you in was because part of what you all do is providing seeds and giving people resources in order to start their gardens. If you can share a little bit about what people can do to get in touch with you, what kind of programs you have offered to folks across the country or in whatever specific areas, and also how people can support your work, because that is also important.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all for the very generous space. And Jared, it's good to reconnect with you. You and I did some work years and years ago. I sent it in the email. Ferguson, we did some Ferguson work together years ago.
My bad. Listen, first of all, as I said at the beginning, I meant to say when you were on camera, on screen, I have completely messed up this whole arrangement. So all of the so I missed a lot of the emails. It is totally my fault. So I apologize, and I'm sorry I missed that. I do not. I have no memory of that, which is part of the problem that we were talking about.
I can't think of it right now, but it was we did some calls organizing around Ferguson, alerting people about what was really going on. It was a collection of like artists and activists and da 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 da.
Wow.
Spotlight on Ferguson is, I think, what it was
Yeah.
called many, many years ago.
It sounds right, but no, thank you for that. And I'm sorry for not remembering. And it is perfectly consistent with what has gone on this morning.
I'm gonna get you that
But
rosemary, and it's just gonna pop back into your mind. but
and I
but
already timestamped the Beats thing. I'm clipping that for the house, if for nothing else. So thank you for
look,
that as well.
I don't write down recipes because you know us. But this is a recipe that I'm willing to write down for folks because it will save your life. But those who cook, I know they already put it in their minds and they know what to do. Renee, to your question, the shelves are going to go empty soon. The shelves are going to go empty. For years, these folks have been practicing in a variety of ways to shut things down. And we thought we were going to see all the tactics or many of the tactics play out on election day. One of the ways you know that he organized to steal the election is because there was no violence on election day, right? But all this preparation has to go somewhere at some point, meaning these folks have been preparing for a race war for decades, particularly once Obama got in office. Recruitment for white supremacist organizing picked up dramatically during Ferguson, BLM. It actually became a recruitment card. It's how we get the devil's work in 2016, right? There are these direct correlations between the election of Obama, the playing out of Ferguson. There were all the different white supremacist groups came to Ferguson to study what was happening there. I personally saw them in the streets at various points. They were tag teaming with police at times. You know, the police would at 2, 3 in the morning would get tired of dealing with the protesters, and they would literally do a changing of the guard where the Oath Keepers would come in with these semi-automatics, and they would become the police, so to speak. And the protesters were left, to be patrolled by vigilantes, essentially. So, that said, there are several different scenarios that could play out, and they could play out all at once. God forbid that we find ourselves in another George Floyd type flashpoint. I don't advise that as Black folks we are in the streets right now. I think we need to organize surreptitiously and silently in the tradition of our ancestors. We need to be silent disruptors in all the ways that we can be. The easiest way to force people into crazy is to disrupt supply chain. And we see the government playing around with that right now. They call it tariffs, but we understand what that is, right? And so the shelves are going to go empty at some point. My prayer is that we have until at least September, because if we have until at least September, then it gives us 2-3 months to organize wide scale across the country and install what I call pallet gardens. Feed Durham, my group, we have been piloting and are going to launch a program to help people install these pallet gardens at their homes, basically for $100 and $150. If you can go and find these resources for yourself for free, some of the raw materials for $100 and $150, you can grow food for 2 seasons, right? So what you need are heat-treated pallets. There are about 1 billion just sitting around in the U.S. every day. There's another 2 billion that are in movement, on trucks, at stores, whatever. Specifically heat-treated. Has to have an HT on the side, or a DB for debarked, or a KD for kiln-dried. And there's a fourth category. It's the European version of a heat-treated pallet. It's a 4-letter series that escapes my mind right now. What you don't want are obviously the plastic pallets that soft drinks are delivered on. Preposition, sorry. And you also don't want wood pallets that have been painted blue. More than likely, those have been cured with methyl bromide. Now, the reason they cure these pallets is because it's wood. So the heat reduces the number of pests in the pallets, but also curing it with these chemicals reduces the number of pests, right? So the chemically treated pallets are being phased out, but they're very toxic. They're carcinogenic. You don't want to plant in those. Again, you want these heat treated pallets. You can find heat treated pallets behind most stores, right? They're usually near dumpsters. Again, it has to say HT on it. So you take a heat treated pallet, you seal it with something like beeswax or linseed oil, not heat treated linseed oil. You want basic linseed oil, the kind that takes 3 days to cure, not the kind that has additives in it to speed up the curing process. And then you can get burlap for free from local coffee beaneries and also from certain produce distributors. And you can Google this process yourselves. You don't need me to explain it to you. But basically, you seal these pallets, use the burlap to create dirt catches, if you will, in either a horizontal or a vertical version of these pallets. And once you get the pallets nailed in or stapled in, I suggest nails because staples don't last in humidity. You put dirt in them and then you plant. You can also take burlap and fill burlap bags with dirt and basically make container gardens, right? Like there are all these cost-effective ways in which we can be installing and setting up our own gardens. It's extremely important that we have autonomy over our ability to eat. And some of these solutions that I'm offering work just as fine in city centers. The main thing is you want to make sure that your food that you're growing is not going to be located near, any sort of like exhaust, maybe from your car or from a dryer vent or something like that. But, long story short, for $150 per household, we can set our houses and our families up to grow their own food, sometimes for even less. Like if you have access, the most expensive part of that project is going to be purchasing dirt. Seeds you can often get at seed exchanges. Some of our libraries have what they call seed libraries, right? A lot of this stuff, if you source it, you can figure out how to get it for free or for damn near free. For those of us who have resources, it is extremely important that we grow food for ourselves and grow food for others, not just ourselves, because food may become currency at some point. We may need it for barter and trade. We may need it to ensure our safety. Like right now, I'm installing about 30 beds out front of my house. I'm in a neighborhood, and that food is for my neighbors. And meanwhile, I have a backyard with my own homegrown apothecary for plant medicine and beds to grow my own food, which I will also give out because it's more food than my household could possibly eat. But you want to grow as much as possible within reason for yourself and for other folks that you don't even know are coming. And then you also want to work on behalf of your neighbors, even the ones you don't like, to install gardens for them if they can't or won't do it for themselves. And you can't just put something on somebody's land, right? Ideally, if you say, neighbor, can I help you install a garden? They come out and they help you do it. But if they're disabled, you want to do this because you basically, you don't want people come through your windows. Food is my security policy. I will do food over a gun. I will do food over ADT or any of these security systems that also, self-report to the police. But people don't typically mess with the folks who are feeding folks and who are holding community down. So if you're concerned about your safety, if you're somebody who won't do guns for whatever reason, you don't want to defend yourself, like your best bet is to feed yourself and to feed your neighbors and to make sure your neighbors know, not in an ostentatious way, but in a real way, that you're down for them, that you're willing to contribute to their safety plan. I recommend that we all grow food, not just for our own houses, but that we position 3 other households to grow food for themselves. And by grow food for themselves, same plan, grow food for yourself, but let's also position you to grow food for a few more folks. And with that, we can get a lot done. Separately, I'm also working with several several organizations that support white progressive women in their organizing to put white women to work for themselves, but also for us. In general, I find that white progressive women are very scared and ungrounded right now. The ones who aren't in denial, the ones who think that there are plenty who think they can wait this out another 3.5 years and just vote for something different. They don't understand that two-party politics is dead, and that the democracy as we know it is also long gone. And so, as a safety strategy for us, and I'm asking for y'all support here because it does put me in the line of microaggressions. As a safety strategy for us, I am willing to work with white women to get them to grow food because they already do it. Springtime is what I call the high holy days of white womanhood. There's a lot of chortling in those garden sections at the Home Depot and at the nurseries and whatnot, and they love a task, right? And putting your hand in soil is grounding. It's deeply spiritual. And so for all these folks who are feeling unsettled, feeling scared, that sort of thing. Again, it's what I said earlier. You have to bring people along and sometimes not tell them what the end game is. My end game is to get y'all get these white folks as grounded and peaceful as possible, so they don't turn on us, right? Because a lot of us are prepared. A lot of us have our own resources, our own stores. And if they're not positioned to have their own thing to feed themselves, then they will turn on us. They will try to take what we have. Like, we already know what the survival games look like, right? And so it's in our best interest to keep them busy and to give them access points to their own freedom through the teaching of proper mutual aid practices, and to encourage them to unwhite, to encourage them to decolonize through meaning through their access to me. That's all they're gonna get. That's all they're gonna get. I'm gonna encourage these folks to unwhite and to see that white supremacy, the capitalism, gobbles them up the same way that it gobbles us up, right? So folks who want to support, you can find us on all socials at Feed Durham NC. And we always need money, because we still live in a time that does money. I do believe that may change soon. But for the time that we're still doing money, you can donate. We have a Cash App, Feed Durham. It's capital F as in feed, and then capital D as in Durham, DURHAM. You can also donate through our Patreon, which is at Feed Durham NC. And we have a GoFundMe that is also the same handle, gofundme.com/Feed Durham NC. In addition to seeding this work, and putting white folks to work for us and for themselves, my vested interest is in making sure that our children know how to grow their own food and that our children are in charge of these processes that are going to become very valuable. So we are training as many Black children as possible in the installation of these pallet gardens. We are training as many Black children as possible in I'm sorry, I looked at something in the chat and I shouldn't have. We're training as many Black children as possible to know how to grow their own food. We just hosted an event called Seed Joy with about 40 Black littles, and they planted hundreds and hundreds of seeds for our people and got to taste food that was ready to go in the ground. So basically like herbs, plant starts and fresh greens. And then, I'm a plant medicine person. I believe in root medicine. I even believe in hoodoo. We did a goldfish drop, teaching ecology. So, a lot of times as Black folks, we'll use pesticides and all kinds of stuff. And people don't necessarily understand that it kills off pollinators. It kills off bees. And we need as many pollinators as possible so that we can eat. If the bees die, we die, because we don't have a way to eat once the bees die. They move pollen to and from and cause all these foods to grow on our behalf. So instead of using pesticides for things like mosquitoes, I teach us to do other things like grow certain plants, lavender, bee balm, mint, catnip. All of those are deterrents to not only mosquitoes, but in marigold, in some instances, certain types of snakes, certain types of spiders, right? So we did a goldfish drop with these kids, And basically, I've got these 2 tanks, these 2 trash barrels out front, and this is going to be some quick Black people math. When I moved into this house, I had the people who owned it before had like all this infrastructure, and they had these yard waste bins. I was never going to pay the city for a yard waste program, but I wasn't going to give them my bins back because, you know, when you give it back, you can't. When you give it to them, you can't get it back when you need it, right? And so these bins began to collect water, and my then partner taught me that if we put goldfish in the bins, it would eat the mosquito larvae and disrupt their life cycle. So I've been doing that for years, and I showed these kids how to do a goldfish drop where, like, we had a recent die off with the goldfish, and all these larvae had built up, and we went and bought some more fish, and I worked with them to get the fish into the tank so that they could see that over 10-15 minutes, all these larvae were going to get eaten up, and the water would suddenly be clear. And then, you know, in time, within a matter of days, there are much, much, much fewer mosquitoes in the air. And then when you partner that with the use of plant medicines, like having lavender grow, you know, nearby in the areas where you don't want mosquitoes, the lemongrasses, anything with an essential oil, most animals that you're trying to repel do not like, including even yard cats. You know, if you got feral cats in your yard.
That's
I'm texting my wife about the anti-mosquito stuff right now.
You can put, if you want to keep your fish for a long time and you want them to grow big like koi, dig a pond or put an oxygen. Basically, you need an oxygenator. So because I don't have an oxygenator in those tanks, those fish die like every year and a half, 2 years, and sometimes they die off before that if we go too long without rain. But basically, the buildup of algae will affect their overall health. And when you put an oxygenator in there, it actually extends their lives. And, you know, in addition to yes to peppermint, I see, and yes, we keep the goldfish. I see your questions. Keep the goldfish until they die. And my plan is to put in a pond with an oxygenator. So back where I have my gardens, one of the things you can do to eliminate aphids and whatnot eating down your leaves on in your garden is you can install a water source that attracts friendly snakes. I know Black folks be scared of snakes. Don't be scared of snakes, y'all. Most snakes are our friends. Most snakes are controlling mice and spiders and all kinds of things, especially in the garden. So you put in a water source like a pond or a fountain or whatever, and it attracts lizards and snakes who will then, and you put in a little bit of stone because they need stone to sun themselves. And you put it as close to the garden as possible. They will then naturally migrate over to the garden and help keep your aphid populations and whatnot to a very low. And then you want to participate in what we call companion gardening. And you can Google this. So when I'm trying to figure out what to put in a bed, I will Google companion garden, whatever the thing that's most important to me goes in the bed. So I'll do companion garden collards, because collards are hard to grow in a place where with deer, like I live. And so I'll put in companion garden collards, and then I'll look at the list of complementary plants, particularly plant medicines that I can put in that bed. And I'm also paying attention to spread, right? So I want to put in plant medicine that's going to grow up and only bunch out a little bit. I would not put mint in a bed because mint goes everywhere, but I would put like rosemary or sage, garlic around the perimeter, that sort of thing. That'll keep out most what Americans call pests, right? I don't think of them as pests. I just don't want them to eat my food. And then, for deer, all bovine like creatures are concerned about things going above their heads because of this, right? Like this going above their heads triggers the feeling that an animal's wrapping around its neck. And so if you want to keep deer out of your garden, all you need is like some fencing or like some wiring or poles or whatever that gives them the illusion of like, it's gonna, like my antlers aren't gonna fit, this thing's gonna hit my neck and I'm not gonna like it. And then you can also put some noisemakers around like aluminum foil and that sort of thing to keep the deer out of your garden. But you want to grow as much plant medicine. Ash, I see you. You want to grow as much plant medicine as you can at this time, because these proprietary blends that many of us buy are not going to be available if supply chain gets disrupted. Like, I'm on a bunch of Dr. Jehudi herbs, and I now have to buy, like, I have to grow my own, like, saw palmetto, St. John's wort, bitterroot is really popular, powwow singers for throat issues, and for those of us who sing, um, it's very helpful in terms of maintaining vocal health and getting rid of sore throats. Yeah. I got a lot of information. Y'all hit me up.
The link is in the show description. Katina, this has been great. Apologies to you and Renee for my forgetfulness. And
Look, we have to boost this, because this was a lot. Like, this was like, we may have to have you back in, like, towards the end of the summer for, like, a recap on what you need to do now.
Yeah, so we can update you on how successful your tactics were in our backyard. And folks, to Renee's point, please, for those of you who are here, please do a little bit more than usual to like, share, subscribe, put this in your socials, comment on the completed video, all the things that boost the algorithm, and send this to somebody, because I know somebody that needs some of this, if not all of it. So send it to them, and let's go.
Jared, can we save the chat? I'd like to read it later. And can I
so it is set
for the live. Once you play it again, the chat will repopulate, and then you can actually scroll through and read the chat.
It is set to have a live chat replay, and so we should be good. But just in case, everybody who said anything in the chat, put all of those comments again in the video once the live ends. Copy and paste, and let's have thousands of comments on the video, and let that help boost and make up for the last minute nature of this and all of my errors. So Rao is on it. Thank you very much. And Katina, thank you very much. And Renee, of course.
Look, we got to thank A-Rob, because this was all me getting notes on Discord. Like, can you reach out to, how do I get you to reach out to somebody? And me saying, send me the email and the name. That's how you do it.
Perfect. So shout out to the Discord.
Yes,
and A-Rob in the Discord. Yes.
I just want to say much respect for what you all do and for what you all represent. It's not often that I get to be in these types of spaces anymore, but this is always where my heart is, with my people. And we share very similar politics and likely share very similar goals in terms of outcomes for our communities. I tell people, don't be scared. My elders are not scared of what's happening right now. In chaos, anything is possible, and we have the best possible chance of getting the world that we want to leave our kids right now. First, we have to be able to feed ourselves. And in feeding ourselves, we have to be able to administer to one another. We have to be able to share the political education that is required to sustain the fight. And we also have to be able to pour back into our community the resources that they think that they're removing. But in fact, when they fire these folks around DEI, it just positions us to pool our resources and call these academics back into our communities, so that they can teach in the projects. They can teach what they learned at that private white institution, what they were teaching at that private white institution in the projects. So, it's revolution time, y'all. Like, some of us were born for this moment. I'm one of them. I believe Jared is one of them. I believe Renee is one of them. I believe many of the people in the chat are those ones. So let's keep going. Y'all can find me at Katina N. Parker on Instagram, and everywhere else at Katina Parker, particularly on Facebook, if you want to follow me personally. But for Feed Durham, it's at Feed Durham NC on all socials, including Patreon and GoFundMe.
All right. Thank you very much, good people. You heard the word. And big thanks to all of you once again. As usual, peace as long as you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll see you next time with more Any Day.
Let's go.
With Renee.